Welcome back to the four-part series on the origins of ancient Israel here at Beit Avichai. The previous three talks lead up to this one. This is the culminating one. We initially started with talking about the Bible and how it was constructed. Then we moved on to archaeological technique, chronologies both in the biblical text and archaeology. We talked about patriarchs next as a case study and how the archaeology dialogues with the text and how it doesn't in some places. The third talk dealt with the tribe of Dan and how the biblical text once again corresponds with the archaeological findings and where it doesn't, and how interpretations can lead us to sometimes surprising conclusions about ethnic identity and about historical reconstruction and about the Bible's own interpretation of ancient history. Today we're going to segue into the bigger picture. We're going to focus out and we're going to look at ancient Israel as a whole and how Israel began as a coherent entity culminating in what we would call a territorial state in the monarchical period. So let's move on ahead. This picture that was drawn in the 19th century shows the children of Israel crossing the Jordan River after the Exodus, going through Jordan, undergoing the circumcision ceremony. They cross at Gilgal into the Promised Land. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the biblical account of Israel's origins. Then we're going to look at the archaeological evidence for new settlement in especially the hill country. Then we will talk about the role of Egypt, because a lot of times that is sometimes neglected. And I will then present a synthesis, which is, I think, new in a lot of ways. I've presented it in various written forms in other places, but I'm going to differ from what other scholars have concluded about this process, the process of Israelite settlement to the beginnings of Israel. So let's start with the biblical account. So first of all, we have the circumcision at Gilgal, which is right next to the Jordan River. And then the Israelites cross over the Jordan River and they conquer Jericho. The walls of Jericho, the trumpets blaring, etc. Joshua 6. And then after that is finished, the Israelites move up to the hill country and they go to a place called Ai, which is taken also by Joshua. There's something interesting about Ai, and that is the word Ai means ruin. So those who understand will understand. So the conquest of Canaan is laid out in the book of Joshua as a sequence of events. It starts off in Jordan, before the rivers cross, the circumcision. Then it moves over to Jericho, the conquest of Jericho, moving up to the central hill country, Ai, and the places around Ai, Bethel and the like, which are also conquered, the central campaign. Then the Israelites move south and conquer towns to the south like Lachish and Eglon and places like that. Then they move to the north. We're not exactly sure where they move from, but they reach the area of Chatzor, the waters of Merom, which may be the Hula Valley, we're not sure. And they conquer the towns in that region, especially Chatzor, emphasis on Chatzor. And following the completion of this conquest, the Israelites move back south and they reach a place called Mount Ebal, above Shechem, and they carry out the culmination and renew the covenant with Yahweh. Here's a picture as represented once again by Tissot in the late 19th century. Now this is described in Joshua 8, but it was actually prophesied already in Deuteronomy 27. Note that I've put prophesized in quotation marks, and you can do with that what you will. Here is the description in Deuteronomy of what the prophecy says. So you shall, once you have crossed the Jordan, you shall set up these stones concerning which I command you today, on Mount Ebal, and you shall plaster them with plaster. And there you shall build an altar to the Lord your God, an altar of stones. You shall wield no iron tools on them, and you shall build an altar to the Lord your God of uncut stones. And you shall offer burnt offerings on it to the Lord your God, and you shall sacrifice peace offerings, and shall eat there, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, and you shall write on the stones all the words of this law very plainly. That's why you plastered it, because you want to write on it. So this is the prophecy, and it's very detailed. And this is a very interesting story because actually, archaeologically, there might be something to it, and we'll get to that in a second. So once again, a map of the tribal inheritances that we talked about in the last lesson also, when we talked about the tribe of Dan. That is one of the main emphases on in the book of Joshua, is defining the territorial expanse of each of the tribes. So everybody knows where everybody stands. Most scholars feel that this document is a Deuteronomistic document that was put together perhaps in the 7th century BC, and that it reflects maybe a later kind of reality, distribution of districts. We're not 100% sure, but it's certainly a later document. In terms of biblical chronology, using the starting date of creation, we're looking at this particular period right here. That is, after the Exodus, the entry into the land, and before the establishment of a monarchy in the time of Saul and then David. So circa 1200 BCE. And right off the bat, let's once again acknowledge that the testament of the text is somewhat different than the testament of archaeology. They conflict in some ways, and in some ways they don't. So we will not skip over the conflicts, because that's in a way what interests us here. So chronologically, from an archaeological historical point of view, we are looking at this time period, the very end of the late Bronze Age into the early Iron Age. So altogether circa 1300 to about 900 or so BCE. And of course it depends which chronology you use, but we're not going to get into that today. Note also that I have a column of the Egyptian dynasties, because to my mind, the Egyptian dynasties and the Egyptian rule and the end of Egyptian rule are crucial to reconstructing what happened and to how Israel began. And I'm not talking just about the sojourn in Egypt and the Exodus. I'm talking about what happens in ancient Israel, Canaan proper. So, starting archaeologically with Jericho. Note, by the way, in Hebrew, Yericho contains the root yereach, moon. Viewed from above, not an aerial picture, but if you are standing on the mountains above Jericho and you look down at Jericho, it looks like a crescent moon, because it's comprised of this marl, this white marl, which is the remains of an ancient sea. So here's Jericho. You would expect to find here a destruction from the late Bronze Age, circa 1230 BCE, according to the biblical text. The only thing is that there is no late Bronze Age destruction. Not only that, there's almost no late Bronze Age occupation at all at Jericho. There is a very substantial Middle Bronze Age occupation, which was destroyed in a massive conflagration circa 1550 or so BCE, but that's hundreds of years before Joshua is purported to have entered the land and conquered Jericho. So already there's a dissonance here, and the original excavators that excavated at Jericho, Garstang and Kathleen Kenyon in the 50s and 60s, realized that there's a problem. There was no massive late Bronze Age occupation at all. There's no way that the city was what was intended in the destruction. It was intended, but there's no evidence for that archaeologically. When we go up to Ai, we think we're pretty sure where the site is. It's called Etel in Arabic, which means the ruin, as does Ai. We also have a similar problem. There's no late Bronze Age destruction. There's not even a late Bronze Age occupation. There's not even a Middle Bronze occupation. There's a really serious early Bronze Age city with city walls and a temple and very rich in finds, but that ended circa 2500 BCE, way more than 1,000 years before the biblical chronology says it was conquered. So that's a bit of a problem. There is an early Iron Age settlement that rests above the early Bronze Age remains, but no destruction of a late Bronze Age city. So we have another problem. Here's the early Iron Age settlement that was excavated first in the 30s and then once again in the 60s by Callaway. You can see typical architecture of the Highland area that we'll talk about more in a bit from those excavations. The Highland is the heartland of Israelite settlement according to the book of Joshua and the book of Judges. This is where most of the action takes place. This is where the early Israelites settled according to the biblical text. The landscape, this is a typical picture of the landscape, valleys, cliffs, a lot of rough terrain. When the biblical text talks about a forest, it's actually a brush forest. It's not big pine trees or things like that. It's not the Mount Tabor oaks. It's very dense, and it's sort of hard to get around up here. If we're talking about the early Iron Age, there is a number of key sites. Here's just a sampling of them. This area was subjected to a series of surveys following 1967 until the early 1990s by Israel Finkelstein, Adam Zertal, and a couple other people. And these sites were excavated, surveyed, plotted on the map, and a lot of information was gained from this. Since the 90s, not too much has been done. Some work was done at Shiloh recently, a couple other places, but for the most part, it's gone a little bit dormant. So, talking about Shiloh, the excavations first by a Danish expedition under Xer and afterwards by Israel Finkelstein in the 1980s. Here's a site located right in the middle. Today there's a settlement, a modern settlement nearby, in the center of the Central Hill Country. It occupies a very important place in the biblical narrative because the tabernacle was brought there and all kinds of things took place. Eli the high priest officiated with his sons. The early Iron Age remains are not really substantial, but they exist and they are very important. So for example, we have this group of houses that was built up against the old Middle Bronze Age wall of the city, which have the usual pillar configuration, storage facilities. They're probably two-story houses. Here's what a wall looks like with a bunch of pithoi lined up against the wall for storing vessels. Here's what they look like, or the assemblage looks like from these two houses when they are restored. Once again, note, as I mentioned before in the previous talk, that there's very little decoration on these vessels. It's very prosaic, very day-to-day. They're not investing in decoration. Another site that was excavated, this time by Amichai Mazar in the late 1970s, is located at Gilo, the southern suburb of Jerusalem. This is what it looked like before the modern neighborhood was built there, and this is the landscape that as it looked when Amichai Mazar excavated this small rural village site. This is what it looks like today. Mazar uncovered these very modest fences and small houses, animal pens, and it was a village, a very small hamlet probably would be a better description, and it's very typical of what you find in the Central Hill Country. There are a couple hundred of these kinds of sites in the Central Hill Country. There are very few larger settlements, and these are mostly located in lowlands. In the highlands area, this is typical. And this is also typical of the kind of remains that you find, shards, fragments of pottery. One on the left is a cooking pot, a typical cooking pot of the very, very end of the late Bronze Age, very early Iron Age, sort of a transitional type. This is something you'll find commonly. It's very rare to find a complete one like that. But mostly it's shardage. And these shards that Mazar recovered from Gilo are all of these large jars that are called collared rim pithoi. Here's an example from Tel Dan of a complete one, because we have lots of complete examples from Tel Dan. These are really, really big storage vessels. They contain something on the order of 130 liters, mostly probably for liquids, though not only, because they have a fairly narrow opening and they can be easily sealed to keep detritus and debris from entering, or insects and things like that. So we think that at least a lot of them were for containing liquids. And one of the interesting things about these collar-rim pithoi is that they are very standardized in size and in shape and the way they were made. These kinds of vessels were first uncovered way back in the 1920s by American expeditions digging at places like Beit El and Beit Sur, and they were identified because of the relationship to the biblical text as being what's called a fossil director of Israelite settlement. Since the biblical text describes the settlement first in the Central Hill Country, here we have all these small settlements in the Central Hill Country. The scholars working in the early 20th century identified these kinds of finds with the Israelite settlement in a very rural, semi-nomadic even fashion sometimes. And that became anchored in our way of seeing the settlement and who was responsible for making these vessels. That's what I learned in university in the 1970s when I was doing my BA. Here's another site which is closer to the coastal plain, not far away from Afek. It's located in Rosh Ha'ain of today. It's an aerial photograph. It's now sort of a park within the built-up area. It's not in great shape, but it's still worth a visit. Note that there's a large building in the center surrounded by smaller buildings. Looking at it in plan, this is another one of Israel Finkelstein's projects. It was a branch off of the Afek excavations in the 1970s. This is Izbet Sarta in plan, where you can see that large central building in the middle, surrounded by a belt of smaller structures around it that maybe created some kind of fortification. Here's a close-up view, and here the picture emphasizes these pits. We talked about pits a lot in the previous talk about Tel Dan, and here we see that it's a phenomenon that is nationwide, if you will. This period, the early Iron Age, is a period of insecurity. If you are harvesting grain, you want to hide it away and compartmentalize it so that if somebody even discovers where you hid part of your grain, you'll still have some of it left, they won't get it all. And so you also have to make sure that it's sealed completely so that vermin don't get into it. And a lot of times it went bad and you couldn't use the grain, especially if a particular kind of fungus attacked it, then it was unusable and even deadly. So these pits reflect a situation of lack of security in the early Iron Age, and there's a whole bunch of them surrounding this building, sort of like we found at Tel Dan that we talked about in the last session. Here's a picture from the field from Finkelstein's excavations showing this really well-preserved structure. It probably had 2 stories. The pillars that support the roofs and the ceilings for the second floor, and the pits that were constructed and dug around the building and then covered up, storing grain. Here's one reconstruction, a possible reconstruction of this structure. They're called 4-room houses or quadripartite houses in literature. And this became the standard house form throughout the Iron Age until the Babylonian destruction. You find them in the city of David in Jerusalem. You find them throughout. Usually, if you are looking at a city house, it's smaller. If you're looking at a rural house in villages, they're bigger. This is one of the main artifacts found at the Izbet Sarta excavations from stratum 2. It's called an abecedary ostracon. What does abecedary mean? It means that we have the alphabet portrayed in it. These ostraca, and it's not the only one, a number of these have been found at several sites from this period and a little bit later, are probably scribal exercises. You can imagine, if you will, a young man, a young boy perhaps, who is learning how to write the ABCs, and he's practicing on a material that is cheap. Most of the writing, the official writing, would have been done on papyrus. Papyrus was expensive and hard to get. And so if somebody's learning how to write, they're going to start using a piece of pottery, And that's what we have in a lot of different places. So in this particular example, you can actually identify the letters. I'm looking at the bottom row here, and in this case it's going from left to right. It could also be from right to left in this period. There's no standard form, but you can see the Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled, Hey, Vav, and you have it all the way to Taf. These are the letters that were used in the alphabet. These are their forms in the Late Bronze Age and the Iron Age. They developed with time. That's a subject for another talk. But you can already see that the alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet, is substantially in place in its order, the same order that we use today. I can give this exercise to school children and tell them to translate it. You can write a text with this using these letters, and it still works today in modern Hebrew. So there is literacy at Isbet and probably not only at Isbet. So if we look at the hill country in general, what is traditionally seen as the heartland of settlement, it turns out that the density of settlement differs from region to region. The real core of the settlement exists in what is today the land of Samaria, the hill country surrounding Shiloh and Shechem. That's where the most settlements were found in Finkelstein and Zertal's surveys. If you go further south to Judah, surveys carried out by Avi Ofer, for example, you have a lot fewer settlements. You have a few here and there, but not nearly the numbers that you have in the Central Hill Country. And the same holds true for the Galilee. The Lower and the Upper Galilee have Iron One settlements, but not nearly as many as the region of northern Samaria. This was the result of Yochanan Aharoni's surveys in the 1950s. And if we look at this in a chart, looking at numbers of sites on the bar graph on the left and the density of built-up area on the right, you can see that the previous Late Bronze Age had very few identified sites, and in the early Iron Age, you have a sudden jump in the number of sites. It comes back to the numbers of the Middle Bronze Age, when it was a much more secure period, when you had a lot of rural settlement and a lot of agriculture in the hill country that contributed to the economy of the larger area of Canaan. So we have this situation coming back circa 1100, 1000 BCE, the same situation that existed previously circa 1600 BCE, and then there was a drop-off in settlements in the Late Bronze Age, and it was very much more empty and a lot less populated, a lot more grown, much more difficult to inhabit. And so there's a reduction in population as well. And this rises again in the early Iron Age. Now we come to Mount Ebal, which we mentioned in the prophecy. Mount Ebal, as we said, is located in the Central Hill Country above Shechem. Here are some pictures, one from the air and one from a side view. This is a very interesting, unique shaped building. A reconstruction looks like this, where there's sort of a central platform, one might call it an altar, and then there are like these two open spaces beneath it containing pits, and these pits contained charred remains of animals and cut marks. And they're all kosher animals, mostly sheep, goat, and cattle. I think a couple deer, but there are no pigs here at all. And once again, pigs can live in this region. There are wild boar in this area today. So the animals are what we would call kosher today, and they've been treated as sacrificial victims and consumed. And these are the remains that are left in this, what appears to be a ritual complex. Adam Zertal, who excavated this in the 1970s, was immediately clear that this is Mount Ebal that is mentioned as the place of Joshua's altar in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Deuteronomy, the book of Joshua. He published some of these finds, including a scarab seal, an Egyptian-style scarab seal, which is probably dated to either Ramses II or Ramses III. So we're talking 13th century, early 12th century BCE. We also have the same kind of late Bronze Age cooking pot at Mount Ebal. It's a very early site relative to the other ones, and it begins in the late Bronze Age, again, circa 1200, a little bit earlier BCE. Now here, once again, is the text of Deuteronomy 27, as it was predicted or prophesied in the book of Deuteronomy. The altar of stones, burnt offerings, this looks like what Adam Zertal found up in the Central Hill Country at Mount Ebal. So Zertal was quite clear that this is what is referenced. Now, bear in mind that this is a late Bronze Age Iron 1 site. After circa 1100 or 1000 BCE, there is no Iron Age 2 occupation at all. There's no 10th century, 9th century, 8th century at all. It's all early. Now, biblical scholars date Deuteronomy and Joshua to being written in the 7th century BCE. Some even make it later into the exilic period. But let's say it's 7th century or even 8th century BCE. That means that whoever was writing about this knew about this place hundreds of years after it no longer was occupied or being used. There's a tremendously old historical memory here. So that's food for thought regarding how historical memory is preserved over hundreds of years and many generations. Now, Israel is mentioned for the first time in a text in the Merneptah stone, which is on display in the Cairo Museum in Cairo, the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. And it's a victory stela, which talks about Merneptah's military incursion into Canaan in order to put down a rebellion at the very end of the 13th century. We're talking about circa 1205, 1207 BCE. And here's what he has to say in a certain portion. Canaan has been plundered into every sort of woe. Ashkelon has been overcome. Gezer has been captured. Yanoam is made non-existent. We don't really know where Yanoam is. And Israel is laid waste, and his seed is not. Well, we know that this is probably hyperbole because Israel was not laid waste, but the Egyptian rulers tended to do that, to make great exaggerations about things that they did that didn't really reflect reality. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? In the text, this is how the word Israel is mentioned in the Egyptian hieroglyphics. It's read from right to left, Yisrael. The Egyptians didn't have a real L, and usually it was designated as an R sound. That little I-shaped hieroglyph is an R sound. And at the very end to the left, you have a seated man and a seated woman and three lines underneath them. This is what's called the determinative of a people. So this is a group of people. It's not a land, it's a group of people. So this is the first mention of Israel. It's pretty much universally acknowledged that that's the case. We do not, however, know exactly where they are located according to this inscription. Most people look at the geography of the names that are mentioned and arrive at the conclusion that Israel is somewhere in the central part of the country and very possibly in the Central Hill Country, but we always have to be careful of finding what we're looking for. But hypothetically, it works. So, given all this data, the settlement, the material culture, the biblical text, several hypotheses have resulted to reconstruct the origins of Israel in the land of Canaan. The first of these is, of course, the model that is presented in the Hebrew Bible. That was accepted by Albright Yadin, Amnon Bentor, with some revision, but basically it's a rapid conquest of the land. And if there are problems and inconsistencies, there are problems with our own interpretations. Maybe Ai isn't actually located there, it's somewhere else. Maybe Jericho had a late Bronze Age level that was completely erased. There's all kinds of ways to explain these things. So this is the rapid conquest model that was de rigueur until about the 1960s or so. But there was also concurrently another model that was forwarded by Albrecht Alt and Martin Noth and adopted by Yochanan Aharoni in the 1950s, that instead looked at the archaeology and looked at ethnography, Bedouins and how people live on the land, and suggested that actually the Israelite settlement and all these small settlements you find in the Central Hill Country in the Galilee are the result of a gradual infiltration from Jordan, from Syria, from the Negev, entering the Central Hill Country, constructing houses maybe on the base of a tent layout, things like that, and that the second step was the conquest of the land, and that the biblical authors writing hundreds of years later reversed the process. A third model that was presented was the peasant revolt that was suggested by Mendenhall and then later on by Gottwald, which had a sort of a Marxist perspective on things and suggested that these are people that are settling in the Highland frontiers that are escaping and revolting against their overlords in the towns in the lowlands. Part of this had to do with Egyptian rule because the Egyptians ruled Canaan during this time, and their vassals were oppressive. And these were peasants who revolted and then ran away up into the hill country and settled up in the hill country. One of the most current models was presented in the 1980s by Israel Finkelstein. I think this model is still accepted by many people. And it suggested that the settlements in the Central Hill Country are a result of nomads who were invisible in the late Bronze Age because they were nomads, building up buildings and villages and sedentarizing because they had no choice, because the economic system collapsed when the Egyptians left, circa 1150 or so BCE. And these are sedentarizing nomads that replicated the Middle Bronze Age system, and that's what we're seeing. And one imagines there's quite a lot to that. At about the same time, Callaway and Steger both suggested a variation on the peasant revolt theme, where these are actually peasants who are ruralizing. It's not so much a revolt, it is just an attempt to expand land holdings, sons that did not inherit land in the lowlands, moving up to the highlands, and establishing new settlements and a new economic base in order to make a living up in the highlands. My sense is that to some extent, maybe even all of these have some justification in them. I think that it's fair to say that the last two are currently the most popular theories. What I am going to do now is present another theory, another hypothesis. And that concerns the Egyptians. So now we're going to take a break and we're going to look at the Egyptians and how they related to the land of Canaan and the process of their rule and their eventual exit. So in the late Bronze Age, there are a series of empires. We have Egypt in the south. Mitanni is located in Syria and in eastern Turkey of today, northern Iraq. The Babylonians, the Kassites, are way in the south. They're less relevant to our story. And you have the Hittites, which are in central Anatolia at this time. The Egyptians, after the second intermediate period, when Semites ruled northern Egypt, and the Egyptians were really incensed about this, carried out a policy of this will never happen again, and they conquered the north, plundered the north, annexed the north, going all the way up into Syria. And they occupied this area. It's most clear that this is the case in Jaffa, where there are remains of the early New Kingdom, circa 15th century BCE. And the system was a series of plunder expeditions that were carried out over and over again by various different kings. One of the most prominent of these is Thutmose III. There's a whole text describing his siege of Megiddo in the 15th century BCE. So this is phase one of Egyptian rule: conquest and plunder, expeditions, military, and taking of slaves and cattle and things like that. Phase two of Egyptian rule in the 14th century BC represents a phase of neglect, where the Egyptian crown has introverted, is focusing on consolidating control within Egypt itself. There's a lot of internal division, and a new king takes the throne, whose name is Akhenaton. He introduces a new religion. It's a revolution of sorts. He moves his capital to a place called El Amarna from the original capital at Thebes and Memphis, and he tries to upend the traditional order of Amun priests and the aristocracy, which are constantly preventing him from ruling in an efficient way. And so he tries to change everything, and he establishes a new kingdom and a new capital in central Egypt. We know a lot about this because this capital contained a library with more than 400 tablets written in the lingua franca of the time, Akkadian, written in cuneiform text, not in hieroglyphics. And a lot of these texts refer to vassal kings or written by vassal kings located in Canaan, the northern Levant, the southern Levant, and they also reflect a great deal of neglect on the part of the Egyptian administration, who's not really supporting these kings, and they're battling each other, robbing each other, complaining about each other. Akhenaten's wife was Nefertiti, of course, the famous statue bust from the museum in Berlin. And here's a picture on the lower right-hand corner of the slide showing the king and the queen with the Aten sun disk. Aten became the chief deity, shining its rays on these two illustrious ruling figures. This is a period when there's quite a bit of chaos in the southern Levant, in the land of Israel, and that's reflected in these texts. In the third phase of Egyptian rule, there's a coup d'etat. The Egyptian aristocracy and the Egyptian hierarchy decides that the neglect is damaging Egypt, and there's also a big problem, and that is that the Hittites are ascendant in the north, and that the subject kings in the north on the borders with the Hittites are beginning to change sides, and the Egyptians become very worried about this. So kings like Seti I and Ramses II reassert Egyptian authority in Canaan by establishing a whole series of control centers throughout the land of Israel, throughout the southern Levant, reasserting power. And here we're into the 19th dynasty, the Ramesside kings especially, mostly occupying the 13th and early 12th centuries BCE. So authority is reasserted in a number of ways. Once again, the big problem is the Hittites in the north, who have expanded their holdings, expanded their alliances, and the Egyptians have reason to be worried. Ramses II establishes a new kingdom, a new capital of the kingdom in Pi-Ramses, which is in the Egyptian Delta, not the traditional one further south, so it's closer to the theater of battle, and it's a staging point into the land of Canaan, if need be. So there's a sort of superpower standoff, and this culminates in a great battle that takes place in Syria at a place called Kadesh on the Orontes River of Syria, circa 1274 BCE. This battle is depicted in a number of, 3 different places at least, in wall reliefs on temples. Here's one from what's called the Ramesseum, where we see the glorious Ramses in his chariot going to battle with his soldiers and battling with the Hittites. And of course, in these reliefs, the Egyptians are victorious. What could be otherwise? But the result of the Battle of Kadesh was a stalemate and an agreement. There was a treaty. And the treaty, fortunately, has several versions. There are a couple versions in Egypt proper, where the treaty is laid out, and you can see that there are exchanges of daughters for wives, there are economic relations going on, the borders and the spheres of influence are determined, and we have the same treaty that was found in the site of Hattusha, or Bogoskoy in Turkey, in Hittite hieroglyphics. So while each side claimed victory, the treaty tells us that this was a standoff, and neither side won absolute victory. It resulted in a treaty which allowed both sides to rebuild and strengthen their economies. So an expression of this at Tel Beit Shan, for example, which is one of the most important Egyptian control centers, is the construction of Egyptian-style governor's residencies. Statues and inscriptions are set up in these places, and we know about them. Ramses III, Seti I is mentioned. A series of kings at Beit Shan are mentioned as victors and as rulers in inscriptions. We have governor's residences. You can go today to the National Park at Beit Shan and look and visit this governor's residence. It's very typical, this shape with a central courtyard and smaller rooms surrounding it. These are Egyptian governors' residences. At Beit Shan, we have oodles and oodles of Egyptian pottery. Some of it's imported, but most of it is locally manufactured by ceramicists who knew how to make Egyptian pottery. You also find Egyptian razor blades. You find, especially at Tel Dan, lots and lots of Egyptian cooking pots. There are a couple of them at Beit Shan, a few at Deir el-Balach in the Gaza Strip, but for the most part, Tel Dan is the place where you have lots and lots of them, which is quite interesting. So here are a couple other Egyptian residences. An earlier one from Beit Shan, from Deir el-Balach. Once again, you've heard that name in the recent news, unfortunately, not for good reasons. Here's a model that was constructed by the Israel Museum of the one that was at Afek, not far from Moshe Ayin. There's even an Egyptian temple at Lachish, excavated by David Oshishkin in the 1970s, that has the same kind of staircase going up to a sort of Holy of Holies, Egyptian-style column bases. You have Egyptianizing art motifs, in this case a goddess who might be Astarte, and the Canaanite pantheon partly was incorporated into the Egyptian pantheon in Egypt proper. So there's a lot of relations going on here, a lot of Egyptianizing in Canaanite art and behavior. If we go further south to the copper mines of Timna, you have an Egyptian presence that is clearly visible. You can visit it and see it today. An Egyptian temple. You have this cartouche of Ramses III offering to Hathor, which is on the cliff above the temple at Timna. So the Egyptians are also involved in mining copper. It might be that the locals are more responsible for the actual labor, but certainly the Egyptians are present as motivating the trade in the copper and the moving it from place to place, especially to Egypt. So also with death, the Egyptian culture is present. Here's a series of coffins that were excavated by Tuda Dotan in Deir el-Balach. These are anthropoid coffins. One of these was also found, or a couple were found at Tel Beit Shan. This is the lid of one of those coffins, and it's very strange, it's interesting. Note the headdress that's on the head of this buried individual as portrayed. It's not naturalistic, but somebody made a point of emphasizing the hair or the headdress. And it looks very much like the figures of Philistines as they are portrayed in Egyptian wall art, especially in battle scenes. So perhaps in this Egyptian anthropoid coffin, there is a Philistine buried in the cemetery at Beit Shan, a Philistine who served the Egyptian crown. So, talking about sea peoples, Philistines, but going back to Dan and what we talked about in the last lesson about Tel Dan and who the Danites were, just to reiterate, we have lots of sea people elements, Cypriot, Aegean elements at Tel Dan. The pithos, which also looks like the pithoi of Cyprus. Something I didn't mention in the last talk, figurines. This is figurine that was found at Tel Dan. Here's another figurine, which is a typical Mycenaean-style mourning figurine. The one in the center looks very much like the Ashdoda figurine, the Philistine figurine that was found at Ashdod. A number of these heads have been found at various places. This is clearly an Aegean/Cypriot characteristic of a group of people who were foreign to Canaan, who entered the land under circumstances that I think are clear now. I'm pretty sure that has to do with the Egyptians. Same goes for the Aegean-style sanctuary at Tel Dan that we talked about in the last lesson. The fact that these corner holies of holies are an Aegean Cypriot phenomenon. So why are there so many elements of sea people material culture exactly in the places where there is Egyptian control, at places like Tel Dan, at places like Beit Shan, Lachish, etc.? Might they be connected to the Highland settlement features? Well, let's see how that might work. Such as the four-room houses, the collared-rim pithoi. Remember, there are Israelites, probably in the Central Hill Country, at this time as well. This is noting a group of people who are belligerent at the time of Egyptian control. Egyptians will still rule Canaan for another 60 years or so. We mentioned the Egyptian style scarab. We're in the late Bronze Age here. These are the things that exist in these settlements, also in the hill country, during the time when the Egyptians have established control over all of the land of Israel, the land of Canaan. And this includes those collared-rim jars, by the way. And now we're getting back to the idea of the standardization that I mentioned before. In the early 2000s, a scholar named Avner Rabban wrote an article pointing out this standardization. And he noted that a lot of these are located at central nodes of control and trade routes. And here are some of those that he mentioned. And he said, this is standardized. This is not a fragmented society where everybody does what they want and there's no standardization. This is a standardized repertoire of storage vessels. It must be something official. He didn't say Egyptians, but that's what he meant, if you read between the lines. And when I look at the distribution of collared-rim pithoi in Canaan at the very end of the late Bronze Age, because that's when we first find them, there are hundreds of them at Tel Dan. There are hundreds of them at Megiddo. Beit Shan has a few. Afek has some. Lachish has a few, although they went undetected. Even Dir Balach looks like it has a couple of hybrid versions. These are located at places where the Egyptians were located at the very end of the late Bronze Age and into the early Iron Age in the 12th century BCE. I think that these were manufactured and sanctioned by the Egyptians as storage facilities that were official, that could be monitored and controlled. This is diametrically opposed to the thesis proposed traditionally. Here are two of those from Tel Dan. So if these are Egyptian, what are they doing in such large quantities in the Central Hill Country? I would suggest that this is a result of an Egyptian surge in the 19th and especially 20th dynasties in order to assert control over belligerents that were located in the Central Highlands. The Egyptians sent veterans of service in the Egyptian army and administration into the highlands. They gave them land grants, just like the Romans did at the end of a legionnaire's service. That legionnaire had married a local woman by that time. They were given a land grant in marginal areas, in bordering areas, and then they were supplied and supported by the Egyptian crown in the highlands, in the north, in the Central Hill Country, and also into Jordan, by the way. In Jordan, you also find these kinds of centers with collared-rim pithoi. The very last inscription of an Egyptian king in Israel, in Canaan, dates to the reign of Ramses VI, statue base made of bronze, found at Megiddo. And from that point onwards, there are no more for a long time. And this suggests to most scholars that this is when Egyptian rule officially ended in Canaan. And then a new world starts. So phase 4 of the Egyptian rule is the withdrawal, circa 1140 BCE. But then the question is, who stays? Who's left behind? Well, if we look at Tel Dan, for example, we have these Egyptian cooking pots in the late Bronze Age stratum, stratum 7, but we have them in stratum 6, stratum 5, even into stratum 4b, into the 10th century BCE. Egyptians stayed at Tel Dan, continued cooking in Egyptian foodways for generations. They didn't leave, at least not all of them. And this is an opportunity to bring up another topic that other scholars, biblical scholars, have written about, and that is the Levites. Levites, the priests, are very interesting in that they have an Egyptian connection. Moses and Aaron were Levites. Of course, they came out of Egypt, didn't they? The name of Moses, according to the biblical Midrashim, would have it that it's from a Hebrew root which means to draw out, draw up out of the water, the whole story with Pharaoh's daughter. But in fact, Moshe is probably the Egyptian word mes, which means son of. Tutmes, Rames, all the mes words, it's like Jackson or Robertson or Ovich in Slavic languages. It just means son of. It's a very common suffix of Egyptian names. And probably what we learn from this is that the real name of Moses was forgotten, and he was just the son of somebody or some god. So that's probably an Egyptian name. Other Levite priests, such as Hophni and Pinchas, have Egyptian names. Others may be too. And the name Miriam probably comes from the Egyptian Meri Amun, the beloved of the god Amun. So there's a whole connection with Egypt from the Levites, and perhaps this is one of the components of the population. Religious practitioners, specialists, Levites who came from Egypt, perhaps bringing a certain kind of religion with them, which might have even been monotheistic or something close to that. So, who were the Israelites? There were Israelites. Some of them were actually called Israelites. We know that from the Merneptah stone. But there were also sea peoples, the Danuna, the Denyen, in the north and maybe in the coast to begin with. There are also Egyptians who stayed and became integrated into this population. And there's all kinds of other ethnic groups too that were assimilated and acculturated and became part of Israel. This might be part of where the tribes came from in their different entities. But the bottom line here that I want to get to archaeologically is that I want to claim that the Israelite settlement, at least to a large degree, was initiated by the Egyptians as a sort of way of controlling the belligerent hinterland, the frontier, sort of in the same way that Israel established Nachal settlements at the beginning of the state's existence, and the way that the settlement movement takes place in Judea and Samaria of today. Once the Egyptians left, things got really complicated. The security was bad. It was much more difficult to subsist because the economy was a shambles. You had lots of immigration. This is a period of collapse throughout the ancient Eastern Mediterranean. People are on the move. There's a lot of violence. We know this from texts and from archaeological evidence. Alliances are shifting. And there seems to be a religious transformation as well. In the Central Hill country sites, there's almost no iconography whatsoever. There's an image prohibition, it seems, unlike the Late Bronze Age. Essentially, this sort of looks like the Book of Judges. And I would suggest that the Book of Judges, while not completely historical, is certainly a reflection of oral histories, handed down stories that were later put down in writing to reflect different groups of people who were integrated into the nation of Israel. And from this point onwards, the nation was created from these various groups. It's a coalescence of a nation, or perhaps nations, Israel and Judah. The borders are then established more concretely, and a kingship is established for better or for worse. If you want to read more about these kinds of things, here are 3 books I would suggest. There are others as well. It's worth looking into. You can even go into Wikipedia. There's a lot about this there too. And frankly, if I teach this in a university setting, this is a course that lasts the whole year. I've just given you a few tidbits here and there to whet your interest, and hopefully you'll continue and go on doing your own reading and enjoy doing that. Thanks very much for being with us for these last 4 sessions. Write me if you have any questions.